Part 1. A Familiar Story. Ken Burns' latest documentary is a detailed and fascinating exploration into the complex social and political events that led up to the passage of the 18th Amendment in the 1920s. Prohibition, which set off an era of unprecedented organized crime and widespread hypocrisy, offers an historical example of a failed, nearsighted policy laden with unintended consequences. The amendment's eventual repeal provides a sliver of hope that the United States' current policy towards the global drug war can also change direction. The parallels between the present-day war on drugs and the temperance movement's push for alcohol prohibition a century ago are plentiful.
America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion. America needs to be taken down to God's bathhouse and the hose turned on her. And the time isn't far distant when the wheels of God's judgment are going to go sweeping through this old God-hating world. And I want to take a pledge in this audience to join me in a pledge that you will never rest until this old God-hating, Christ-hating, whiskey-soaked, Sabbath-breaking, blaspheming, infidel, bootlegging old world is bound to the cross of Jesus Christ by the golden chains of love.
Both policies sought to address a social evil and acted to curb its dangerous effects through legislative measures of restriction. In both cases, the results of these control measures disproportionately affected minorities and lower-class citizens. In both cases, astronomical proportions of the federal budget were allocated to increase law enforcement capability from the local to the national level, which included everything from interdiction, eradication, search and seizure, criminal punishment, and intelligence. In both cases, the government and its supporters maintained a doctrine of infallibility despite the campaign's growing futility. But any one of us can go out today and legally buy a pint after today's class, provided we're 21. Get in the car after a few more, however, and well, now you've broken the law. The controls of social behavior operate on a spectrum. Some Latin American leaders have recently called on the region, and more specifically the United States, to explore the vast middle ground that exists between the two polar extremes of outright prohibition and wholesale legalization. And yet, despite the calls for a rational debate on alternative approaches to drug policy, the Obama administration has maintained a posture of childish obstinacy. It behaves as though it is immune from public critique and empirical evidence, and it has refused to engage regional leaders in any semblance of thoughtful dialogue. Why? Is it a fear of admitting that this country's drug policy has been an abject failure? Or perhaps it is reluctant to confess this categorical misread of domestic and foreign drug policy to its own backyard. Either way, a glance at the numbers reveals it is a rather difficult square to circle. And yet, we carry on. But before we get to the numbers, we should consider the stakes at play. Part 2. Everyone suffers in political quicksand. In 1968, Richard Nixon ran a successful campaign centered on reestablishing law and order. By 1971, he had narrowed his homeland target on a pervasive evil poisoning the streets: drugs. His administration unleashed a full frontal attack on dealers big and small, users young and old, and thus the phrase, "war on drugs," was permanently etched into the nation's collective vocabulary. Political currency is priceless. Political suicide, unthinkable. Any society interested in its own survival and striving towards self-improvement would, by necessity, rank self-correction paramount among its principles in the social contract. In order to thrive, we must learn from our mistakes. The catastrophic failure that was alcohol prohibition in the 1920s provided a wonderful opportunity for politicians and policymakers to self-correct, to learn from past mistakes. But again, political currency is priceless, and political suicide unthinkable. Herein lies the false dichotomy at work in today's war on drugs, that there exists only two options: either outright prohibition or uncontrolled free market legalization. From that premise, it is rather obvious to conclude which route to take. After all, drugs are bad, so we should wage war on drugs, right? Politicians get to look tough in front of voters. The drug bureaucracy is delighted with ever-expanding budgets. We lock up petty offenders and clean up the streets. A straight-up win-finity. Unfortunately, the desired effects don't equate to actual success, which is evidenced by the fact that year after year, the federal government announces substantial budget increases to continue its all-out fight. In 1971, the federal government allocated $600 million to combat drug supply and drug use. Today, that number sits roughly at $51 billion. To put it plainly, the war on drugs fails even on its own terms. So what are its terms, and how exactly does the government implement a strategy toward achieving their stated goals? The goal, albeit lofty and perhaps unrealistic, is to eliminate domestic drug abuse through the eradication of the narcotics supply coming from the coca-growing regions of the Andes, the marijuana fields of Mexico, the opium fields of Afghanistan, and any site that assists in their trafficking along the way. For the drugs that manage to infiltrate the borders and fall into the hands of users, we search them, arrest them, convict them, incarcerate them, and demand that they never do it again, lest they want to repeat the process. How effective are these tactics in achieving the stated goals? Part 3. From the earth to the nostril. We will now examine the human cost of the drug war. A brief journey with cocaine from the cradle of the Andes to the cells of the United States prisons will help to illuminate this exercise of futility that is the United States policy approach. In the year 2000, the United States government took an unprecedented step to curb drug production in Colombia by airily spraying coca plants with herbicide. Basically, the Roundup you can buy at a Home Depot on steroids. As an aside, U.S. taxpayers have paid more than $1 billion for aerial spraying in Colombia. By 2007, 2.6 million acres had been sprayed with herbicide. The unfortunate existence of wind undermines the precision of the fumigation efforts and results in the destruction of food crops like corn and yucca, the death of cattle, and essentially a loss in the ability for peasant farmers to maintain their subsistence farming. Furthermore, the coca is resilient. Within 2 months, new growth emerges. Coca survives fumigation. Unfortunately, other crops like cassava and yucca never return. One cocalero remarked, "You know with coca you're not going to get rich, but at least you could harvest 2 kilos, and from that you could live. But without our land, what are we going to do?" The fumigations only address the symptoms, not the causes. Leaders in the region have urged the United States to examine an overhaul of the current fumigation practices, claiming that only a redirection of funds to support regional development investments will phase out the growing of coca. Basically, provide farmers in the region an optimistic, viable alternative to growing coca. The issue of cocaine production in Colombia is a direct result of extreme poverty and social injustice. Pedro Arenas, the mayor of San Jose de Guaviare, whose town has had to absorb thousands of displaced peasants, expressed the dangers of these measures, saying, "The fumigations, besides destroying the rural economy, has also inhibited people's access to food. Colombian people and our campesinos do not want to live a criminal life. They are often forced to resort to these illegal activities due to physical necessity and in many cases because of hunger." So the United States must ask itself, after billions of dollars and countless livelihoods destroyed, are these the people we intend to target in our war against cocaine? Instead of destroying lives and ecosystems, could we not redirect these mass quantities of cash into a more productive form of social investment? The next stop is the cartels themselves. These drug warriors terrorize communities throughout Latin America by way of kidnapping, torture, coercion, and murder. Unlike the peasant farmers growing and processing the coca leaves, it is these drug lords that get rich quick in the trafficking of cocaine. As previously stated, the current policy of interdiction creates the price support which generates these organizations vast amounts of wealth, which in turn boosts the incentive for illegal activity. These networks are incredibly adaptable and have evolved over the years into highly effective and lucrative businesses. After all, the demand for illegal substances makes those substances highly valuable, and those willing to take the risk to deliver the goods are thoroughly compensated. Part 4. Calls for Reform. Several former Latin American presidents, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Cesar Gaviria, and Ernesto Zedillo of Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico respectively, have publicly condemned the approach of the United States and Latin American drug wars, and have called for a paradigm shift that must focus on health and education, not repression. Last year's Organization of American States Summit in Cartagena, Colombia, produced similar requests by Guatemala's President Otto Pérez Molina, Colombia's Juan Manuel Santos, and Argentina's Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. There is a growing consensus among leaders of the region to, at the very least, consider a dramatic rethink of the drug war and to begin a more honest and engaged discourse about possible alternative policy options. Once again, prohibition is the extreme right pole, while free market legalization represents the far left side of the spectrum. Support for decriminalization and legalization does not imply support for drug use. On the contrary, advocates of a drug regulatory system are after the same results as those in ardent support of prohibition. That is, the effective and sustained reduction of drug-related crime and drug-related deaths. It is becoming more and more obvious that the current war produces nothing but stronger cartels, untreated addicts, destabilized societies, and promotes corruption at all levels of government. After all, this is a business. And so the courage of Latin American leaders and anti-drug war advocates in the United States should be applauded, for they are fighting an uphill battle that dares to challenge the status quo. From the prison industrial complex, which thrives off current drug policy, to the formidable drug cartels, who will not easily surrender their stranglehold on the market. From politicians who fear political oblivion by appearing to their constituency as being soft on drugs, to the deeply ingrained negative assumptions people hold about drugs and criminals. Fortunately, advocates of drug policy reform have the current war on drugs as evidence for the desperate need of reform. In 2001, Portugal enacted national legislation that decriminalized all drugs, including cocaine and heroin. This applies to the purchase, possession, and consumption of all drugs for personal use, defined as the average individual quantity sufficient for 10 days' use for one person. Even in the decriminalization framework, drug usage and possession remain prohibited or illegal, and they are subject to police intervention. But decriminalization means that infractions have been removed completely from the framework of the criminal law and criminal justice system. Instead, they are treated as purely administrative violations, to be processed in a non-criminal proceeding. Portugal created an agency called the Commission for Dissuasions of Drug Addiction, and it is the body solely responsible for adjudicating all administrative drug offenses. First-time offenders are given a warning, and rarely does the Dissuasions Commission issue fines or penalties. Rather, repeat offenders are offered treatment and job training. Part 5. Hope in the Hidden Consensus. How do we promote an honest debate about drug policy in the United States? There are willing and able players all over the region waiting for the United States, the main consumer and principal financier of the drug war, to start listening. Beating the hornet's nest ensures that the hornets will never settle down. It's time to stop throwing water onto a grease fire. It's time to stop shoveling water. It's time to abandon drug war metaphors and move into our closing statements. In 1973, Congress installed an electronic voting system. Since then, the number of recorded votes has skyrocketed. This is not so the average citizen can track the voting records of their representatives. Rather, it is used to the benefit of political parties so that they can put their adversaries' vote in the spotlight come election time. There is a term on Capitol Hill called a third rail issue. On the subway, there is a third rail that is highly electrified, and touching it results in death. The war on drugs has become a third rail issue. Voting against the status quo is analogous to placing a loaded pistol on the table and praying that your political challenger will not shoot you in the face with it. Recorded votes also let lobbyists know that they've bought their money's worth of loyalty. Remember, political capital is priceless, and political suicide unthinkable. And there is political strength in numbers. The public votes of congressional representatives don't necessarily reflect their private views. If we want a more responsible legislature, one that votes for the future benefit of society rather than ensuring their own political careers, maybe we need less accountability in Congress, at least temporarily. The non-binding, anonymous straw poll would be a perfect initial voting method. This would allow politicians to vote their true leanings without the fear of being electrocuted by the third rail. For that moment, politicians could vote for the nonpartisan common good as they truly perceive it. And who knows, maybe there exists a closeted majority, some hidden consensus that partisan politics doesn't allow itself to see. As it stands, the United States government is stuck in a Chinese finger trap with regards to the drug war. Intuitively, they keep pulling and pulling and pulling, fumigating and interdicting, arresting and convicting. Mark Twain, a famous repeat offender of spot-on insight and social satire, once commented, "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. Fanatics will never learn that, though it be written in letters of gold across the sky. It is the prohibition that makes anything precious. Prohibition breeds contempt for the law. No one enjoys being told what to do and what not to do. If it is true that this country was founded on the idea that personal liberty should be expanded, not contracted, then it is about time that this country act to restore the public trust in its public officials. If it is true that this country is one of freedom and ideals, then it is time that this country acts to breach the divide between stated ideals and flawed action. Without such efforts, the United States cannot and should not expect the admiration or respect of its citizenry or the world at large, a position of authority it has come to believe is its God-given right. A broken nation, intent on projecting itself outward without addressing its own wounds, will only assist in the poisoning of the very nations for which it claims to be fighting. And we believe a genuine reevaluation of the war on drugs would be a fine place to start the internal healing process.